In August of 1982, my buddy Tom and I took a weekend trip from Sunnyvale, California, up to Lassen National Park. We'd visited once before with a church youth group and had such a great time that we decided to relive the adventure, but this time without any chaperones. The freedom that comes at 20 is something else. We set up camp at Lost Creek Campground, right near the edge of the park. On our second day, we were feeling adventurous and decided to trek down an old, overgrown logging road. We knew where it led because we'd hiked it during our last visit. The path was lined with stumps and scattered debris from old logging projects, the dirt molded into permanent tire grooves. The road stretched about 3,000 feet north from our campsite before intersecting with a fire road. From there, we walked west for about 100 yards until we reached a small meadow. After a quick stroll across it, we reached Lost Creek, perfect for cooling off our feet in the icy water. As the sun began to dip in the sky, Tom suggested we head back to camp. It was creeping up on 7 p.m., and neither of us fancied getting lost in the dark. We retraced our steps to the fire road and began walking east. That's when we saw it. Around 200 yards ahead, there was what seemed like a tall, dark figure moving away from us. At first, I thought it was just a large man, maybe sunbathing in a really odd spot. But then I squinted and told Tom, "Check out this guy." The figure was moving slowly and purposefully, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The figure stopped in its tracks, shifted to the left side of the road, and seemed to be investigating something. It moved with a strange, fluid grace, its arms swinging with each step. What really struck me were its massive shoulders. They formed a pronounced hourglass shape, which was bizarre. After what felt like an eternity, the figure disappeared, either curving with the road or slipping quietly into the woods. Tom and I didn't say much as we hurried back to camp, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a person or something else entirely? The figure seemed so large, easily over 6 feet 5 inches and maybe 300 pounds. I couldn't be sure from that distance. That night was uneventful, but the next morning, around 5:45 a.m., we were jolted awake by a series of yelps and growls coming from the direction of our hike. The sounds were powerful and eerie, echoing through the still morning air. I don't know if anyone else at the campground heard it, but it left an impression on us. Tom and I didn't talk about it much afterward, either to each other or anyone else. It wasn't until years later that I brought it up, hoping to make sense of what we'd witnessed. To this day, we can't agree on what we saw or heard. I've shared the story with my wife and kept it mostly to myself beyond that. It's one of those strange memories, vivid yet inexplicable, that lingers on the edges of my mind. Early one morning, before the sun was even up, my buddy Jake and I decided to head out for a hike up a ridge in Madera County. We were hoping to spot a deer worth bagging. We had been camping out there for 11 days, completely off the grid, and hadn't seen another soul. We parked our truck just below the ridge, figuring that once the sun started to rise, we could make it to the top in about 20 minutes. As the light began to creep over the horizon, highlighting the ridge, we noticed someone already up there. He was dressed entirely in black, which struck us as odd. No flashlight, no gun, just digging around in the brush. We laughed it off, joking he was probably some clueless city hunter from LA. Who else would wear black in the middle of deer and bear season? He poked around in the brush for a good half hour, taking long breaks just to stare out in different directions. Then he started heading down the hill towards us. We hadn't left the truck yet, so we just sat there watching him. The guy moved a little, then stopped and looked around like he was hunting, except without a rifle. We both thought it was just a regular human at first, and we made more jokes about how this guy was going to walk right into our laps. Then the light improved, and he kept coming our way. When he got to about 50 yards away, Jake and I suddenly realized we were not looking at a man. This was Bigfoot. He moved like a human, but clearly wasn't. Jet black, shiny fur covered him head to toe, with a reddish tint around the eyes. At that moment, I was ready to jump straight back to camp in one leap. I had to get a closer look, and since he hadn't noticed us, I figured I'd quietly open the truck door. But that old Ford was anything but stealthy, and the latch made a loud noise. The creature stopped and turned to look right at us before bolting into the brush. I scrambled to bring up my scope for a closer view, but this creature was fast. Before I could even aim, he vanished behind a tree and didn't reappear. It took every ounce of courage I had to walk up to the tree, but when I did, it was like he'd vanished into thin air. Jake was yelling at me not to shoot and thought I was nuts for trying to find Bigfoot or at least some tracks or signs. All I know is that my perspective on the woods changed completely after that day. I grew up in these woods, camping and hunting year after year, living off tall tales and rumors, but that morning made me rethink how close I want to get to those stories. Now, I keep a healthy distance between myself and anything big lurking around out there. Back in September 2003, I was up in the northern part of New Mexico, training to become a wildland firefighter. Around the second week of that month, I got dispatched with a crew of 22 others to help out with the Del Loma fire in the Shasta Trinity Forest area of Northern California. We flew out of Albuquerque, and there were two crews packed into that plane, each with about 20 people. For most of the 2 weeks, we were on standby, waiting on instructions. As it got closer to the end of our assignment, about 4 days out, we set up camp near a river, roughly 5 to 10 miles from where the fire had been raging. It was close to sundown when I started hearing some commotion outside my tent. A couple of guys were getting pretty worked up over something, but I didn't think much of it, at least not until one of my crew members yanked me out of my tent. Confused, I asked, "What's the big deal?" He just pointed across the river. When I looked, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was this massive, hairy creature just strolling along the riverbank, minding its own business. It was the biggest mammal I'd ever seen. The way it stood on its hind legs was so human-like. It had this dark, long hair, stood around 7 feet tall, and had a muscular build that you couldn't ignore. By then, I was the fourth person just standing there, mouth agape. We watched it watch us for about 5 minutes. More folks came over from the camp, some bringing flashlights as the sun was slipping behind the horizon. That seemed to be the cue for the creature, because it suddenly darted into the trees. I swear it moved with such speed, covering ground in long, powerful strides, disappearing in about 3 seconds flat. And the way it moved the trees, pushing them aside like they were twigs, was just unreal. These were thick, tall trees, and they swayed in its wake. It was getting pretty dark, but the light was just enough to see the direction it was headed. Up the mountain, there was a clearing, and we caught sight of it one more time before it vanished for good. The whole time, it didn't make a sound. No screams, no yells. It seemed almost timid, which was strange given its size. I'd heard plenty of stories about Bigfoot over the years and always wondered, but seeing one in real life really hits differently. It gave me this profound sense of respect and made me realize there's so much out there that we still don't understand. There's a lot more to the world than meets the eye, that's for sure. I was about 14 when this crazy experience happened. My family owned a ranch out in Tehachapi, California. It was a huge place, with sprawling fields and a backdrop of forest. I loved riding my horse around there. One afternoon, as usual, I set out on a trail that led me to the edge of the woods, still on our land. It was a place where I felt free, a real escape from everything. As I rode along, I stumbled upon something unsettling: a dead cow. It must have been there for quite a while because it was mostly reduced to bones. I remember my heart skipped a beat. It was such an eerie sight out in the open like that. My curiosity got the better of me, and I scanned the surroundings. Still seated on my horse, something caught my eye. That's when I saw him. Bigfoot. Or at least, I thought it was. He was towering, covered in black hair, and so eerily human-like. He noticed me too, and oddly enough, he didn't seem scared at all. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was Bigfoot, one arm resting against this giant tree, looking right at me with a gaze that was almost curious. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. I was frozen. I mean, how often do you come face to face with a legend? That rush of fear finally hit, and my instinct to survive kicked in. I turned my horse around and galloped back to the ranch, my heart pounding like it would jump out of my chest. For years I banished this memory to the back of my mind. I guess the intense fear convinced me to forget. Recently I was chatting with my dad about the ranch. He's 90 now, and I asked him if we still had those 10,000 acres. He said no, but then out of nowhere, I asked, "Hey, did anyone ever say they saw Bigfoot around the ranch?" He looked at me knowingly and said, "Yes." It was strange hearing him confirm it, like proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I told him I could take him to the exact spot where I believed I saw Bigfoot, and he said someone in the area probably has seen him too, because apparently he's still out there, living his mysterious life. This happened nearly 28 years ago, but the memory is as vivid as if it was yesterday. The way Bigfoot looked at me, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath, it all comes rushing back. It's amazing how a single moment can etch itself so permanently in your mind.